So the pandemic has had a very significant impact on people's health and people's lives. You'll be aware of that. But also it's had a very significant impact on the Irish economy. And since we've gone to level 5, there's obviously much greater calls upon the resources within your department. Can I just ask you, Minister, if you could set out for the House what do you believe is the impact of the country moving to level 5 and the impact that's going to have on public expenditure in the country for 2020 and beyond?
Thank you very much, Cian Corla. Deputy, thank you for your question. COVID-19 has had a profound effect on our citizens, and the Government has taken significant steps to cushion the impact of the crisis on households and businesses. Expenditure Report 2021 outlined the significant additional resources allocated to the departments in response to COVID-19. At that time, gross voted expenditure of €87.1 billion was estimated for 2020. This represents an increase of €16.7 billion relative to the allocation set out in Rev 2020, published in December of last year, primarily driven by additional expenditure allocated to support our key frontline services in responding to COVID-19 and to support workers and businesses devastated by the impact of the virus. The Government's response has been driven by the overarching need to protect our citizens from the virus and to ensure that our health service can respond effectively to meet demands for services while dealing with the impact of the pandemic. And as you know, Deputy, the Government introduced the COVID restrictions support scheme and enhanced the employment wage subsidy scheme, and indeed reinstated the top rate of the pandemic unemployment payment. Gross voted social protection measures of just over €30.3 billion was set out in the 2021 expenditure report for this year. Taking account of the impact of the Christmas bonus, this would have brought social protection expenditure to just over €30.7 billion, reflecting the position in the labour market at that time. However, the further revised estimate for 2020 that was presented to the Dáil on November the 4th set out expenditure of over €31.5 billion, an increase of over €800 million relative to the position on budget day in October. This increase on budget day reflects a number of things. Yes, the increased number of recipients of the PUP, the reintroduction of the €350 weekly rate, the cash flow impact of a change in the frequency of payments in respect of the employment wage subsidy scheme, and indeed an increase in the rates of the employment wage subsidy scheme. Finally, in relation to the CRIS scheme, the move from level 3 to level 5 has added approximately €40 million per week, Deputy.
Yeah. Thanks very much, Minister. And I want to commend you for the measures that you've introduced since you've been Minister. In particular, I think it was very appropriate that the PUP went back up in light of the imposition of the level 5 restrictions. I also think the CRIS scheme is very appropriate and much needed. However, obviously all of this is costing money, Minister. And I suppose there was an issue as to whether or not we move to level 5 or not. And I think it is probably the most severe restriction, and the cost of it on the state is quite considerable. I don't know whether, Minister, you're able to identify what is actually the cost of us having moved to level 5 restrictions. Because I know from your point of view, you introduced a very successful and well-received budget. But 10 days after it, a decision was made to go to level 5. That obviously has had an impact on the budgetary outlook for the country into the future. But I do think we need to recognise that if we hopefully move out of level 5 at the end of this month, that we need to try to ensure that we be very careful about going back there, because there's a limited amount of money that's available. Obviously, we can borrow at present, Minister, but as you know yourself, maybe that borrowing won't be as cheap into the future.
Thank you very much, Deputy. And yes, there has been a very significant impact on the public finances as a result of moving to level 5. If you take, for example, the number of people on the PUP payment, it's increased by over 100,000 people in that period of time. It's now standing at over 350,000 people. So the weekly run rate, payment rate, has gone from about €66 million per week at level 3 to €104 million per week under level 5. Now, some of that will be accounted for by the reinstatement of the €350 per week rate. But there is an impact there, obviously, from the move to level 5, with over over 100,000 people extra on the PUP payment. Because of a time lag, that number could increase further, though we certainly hope and expect to be out of level 5 in 2 weeks' time, as you know. And in relation to the CRIS scheme, the increase in the cost of that, as I said a moment ago, from going from level 3 to level 5 is an extra €40 million per week. So these are very significant sums. They do have an impact, and it is of course a factor for government in making decisions alongside, of course, the overarching objective of keeping our people safe.
Yeah, thanks very much, Minister. Obviously, the real effect of level 5 is that it has a significant impact on the domestic economy. I suppose when we look at an overview of how the economy has performed as a result of the restrictions, that the multinational sector has performed very well. But I suppose the difficulty we have is when we impose level 5 upon the country, what we're doing in effect is we're closing down a large part of the domestic economy. We're closing down the non-essential retail outlets, the hairdressers, the restaurants, the shops that don't sell essential items. So I suppose, Minister, and maybe it is a difficult thing to say, but I suppose into the future we need to be careful if there's pressure put on us to go back into level 5 at some stage next year, because we've seen from the imposition of level 3 that level 3 can be very effective. It did have an effect in terms of bringing down the numbers over the past 3 weeks. And when pressure comes on again in terms of going to level 5, I think it is perfectly legitimate for you, Minister, as Minister for Public Expenditure, to express the concern that if we start spending significant amounts of money again, we may not be able to afford other services.
Thank you very much, Deputy. And as you have rightly said, the impact on different sectors in the domestic economy has been really acute. And if you look at the breakdown of the profile of people who are on the PUP payment, the largest sector is accommodation and food service at about 103,000, followed by wholesale and retail trade, about 57,000. Other sectors like hairdressers, beauty salons and so on, about 31,000. It isn't a direct competition between health and the economy. The job of government is to weigh up the competing considerations. Our first priority as a government has to be to help keep our people safe, to ensure we invest in our public health service, to only impose restrictions where we believe they are absolutely necessary. And I think the response of government in supporting businesses, in supporting incomes, in protecting employment where we can, has been noteworthy, and you've been good enough to acknowledge that. And I think where people have a lack of confidence about public health, that impacts on the economy too. So we need to get both right.